Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our session titled Strategy and Collaborative Networks for Uncertain Times. And just to introduce the context for today's discussion, as a community of change agents and systems innovators, one thing we may have experienced is the difficulty of setting coherent strategies and charting the right course when there are so many interdependencies, there's so much complexity and ambiguity with every decision. So for example, a decision may involve multiple stakeholders, each with different goals and views of the system, or the change that's needed simply isn't obvious, and the route towards it is filled with unknowns. And so in these cases, how do we go about charting a path? And what are some effective ways we can go about achieving it? And so to discuss this, we're very grateful to have joining us today Ed Morrison, who is the founder of the Purdue Agile Strategy Lab and currently directs the Agile Strategy Lab in the College of Business at the University of North Alabama. And Ed is the creator of a discipline called strategic doing, having co-authored a book of the same name, and has over 20 years of experience developing new network-based models for strategy in open, loosely connected networks, and describes strategic doing as an open source operating system to build new ecosystems. And this is widely used across the US and is expanding internationally. So welcome to the show, Ed. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. I thought I'd spend about 20 minutes and go over some slides that would introduce some of these concepts, and then we could have a discussion, and perhaps the audience would like to ask some questions as well. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do that, but let me just kind of share my screen now. Okay, are we set on the shared screen, Owen?
Yeah, all set.
Wonderful. So I've broken this into 3 parts, kind of giving you some context of the work that we've been doing with strategic doing. Why is it that we're working on this and have been working on it for several decades? Give you a strategic doing in a nutshell. And then once you understand kind of the basics of strategic doing and what it is, how we're using it now to build new systems and develop new approaches to systems. So let's start out with what's changed. Essentially, the challenge that we have is leaders need to be able to distinguish among different types of problems. The simple problem, of course, is just a task list. We're familiar with that. More complicated problems often involve teams and technical solutions that we can find: repairing your car, repairing an automobile, repairing a computer, all examples of technical problems that can be solved. But increasingly, we're facing complex problems. And the complexity is both in the environment in which we're operating. Think about climate change, of course, but the complexity of a variety of different new markets emerging, the intersections of different technologies, of course. And then also inside our organizations, there's complexity. There's increasing complexity as the organizational structures are reforming and breaking down in many cases. So this is really the big shift, and it's really one way of thinking about it is just moving from complicated to complex. We use an SCurve to explain this, and we put it in the context of a big industrial change. So in the US and across the advanced economies beginning in the 1830s, 1840s, we had industrialization. In the 1870s, 1880s, the organizational structures of hierarchies started to form. And then, of course, starting with globalization in the 1970s and accelerating with the internet in the 1990s, we've had a collapse of these hierarchical structures and an emergence of network-based structures. So this is the big shift that's happening, and we're in the middle of it, and we'll continue to be in the middle of it for the foreseeable future. So our challenge is to design what's next. Our challenge is to take assets that we have access to in our companies, in our communities, our organizations, our networks, our supply networks, and figure out how do we design new structures that enable us to create value, sustainable value, prosperity, meet the challenges of climate change and the like. So strategic doing is really designed around addressing that challenge. So let's go into strategic doing in a nutshell. We started out with the notion that Deming came up with, which is that if we didn't have a process that we could describe pretty clearly, then we didn't really know what we were doing. And so it took us many years to figure out, do we really have a process that we can describe? And we figured out how to do this and figured out how to describe it. And so that's really what strategic doing is. It's a process. And what strategic doing does is creates an open source operating system, and we can go into what that means to us, for complex collaborations, open innovation, and ecosystem development. It's situations in which the organization or you and the leadership group don't have control over the different assets that you need to build a new value proposition or a new solution to a complex challenge. So it's a situation where we have to do strategy in an environment where nobody can tell really anybody else what to do. So what does strategic doing do? It enables people to form action-oriented collaborations quickly, move them toward measurable outcomes, and make adjustments along the way. So what we're focused on is moving ideas into action quickly. We're focusing on generating data from those collaborations, the projects that we develop, and to make adjustments by learning quickly as we go forward, because by definition, we can't really know standing here the full contours or the challenges of a complex problem. Starting out with strategic doing, however, we had to confront a difficult challenge, which was, what is strategy? And of course, if you go into the academic literature, you'll get, dozens of definitions of strategy. But the one we found most compelling was developed by Kathleen Eisenhardt out of Stanford, who developed a notion of strategy as answering two questions. Where are we going, and how will we get there? So that's a rigorous definition of strategy. If you can answer where are we going, and then how will we get there, you have by definition a strategy. But if you apply that rigorous definition to a lot of strategies, you can see oftentimes they fail because they don't completely answer these two questions. So how do we address or answer these two questions in the context of a collaboration? Well, of course, we need to have a conversation. So the focus of strategic doing is on designing and guiding conversations, which is the smallest unit of human change here. And so how do we actually do this? We frame a strategic challenge, and then we ask ourselves, what could we do to meet that challenge? Of all the things we could do, what should we do? And when we answer those two questions, what could we do and what should we do, we get a definition of what an outcome might be, what it would look like, how things would be different, how would we measure that outcome. Next, we move on to what will we do and what's our 30-30. What will we do essentially invites us to start thinking about the projects, the experiments that we could start that would enable us to test our assumptions, to figure out what's working. Are we moving toward the outcome that we've agreed on? What's our 30-30 is a question that we developed early on in the strategic doing development. And that is a meeting where we come back together and we say, what did we learn the last 30 days? What are we going to do the next 30 days? It's the double loop learning, or it's the enablement of us to learn and adapt as we go forward. Now, underscoring these 4 questions, there are 10 rules. So in order to really understand how to design and guide those conversations of 4 questions, there are 10 rules or 10 skills involved. And so the logical structure of strategic doing really looks like this. There's 2 questions of strategy that we need to answer in the context of a conversation. Those conversations have to be focused around 4 questions. And in order to design and guide, we get very good at those 4 questions, you need 10 simple rules or 10 skills to work on those skills. And it turns out that nobody is good at all 10 skills, which is a really good emphasis, a really good important point that in order to manage these complex conversations, you really need a cognitively diverse team, because nobody's good at all 10 skills. Now, what we've been able to do is come up with an approach to strategy, which we're very happy to say is getting widely accepted, both in communities, regions, government organizations, increasingly companies. And surprisingly, our colleague, I got to meet Yo-Yo Ma, and he was excited about this because he wants cultural institutions to build new approaches to rebuilding communities. Now, in systems work, of course, you're familiar with the iceberg model. And so we can translate this into the notion of the iceberg model, where we have to answer this two clear questions of strategy. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? But we need to have a conversation about the 4 questions that we've outlined. And in order to really understand those 4 questions, you really need the 10 skills. But at the base is really a changing of our mental models from more hierarchical, vertical thinking to much more horizontal, network-based thinking. Well, over the years, we've been doing strategic doing workshops. This is very much of a garage startup. We've been working in a variety of different contexts. We've tried to identify the hardest problems that we could come up with to help people solve. And starting about 4 years ago, we started building out a university-based network because these skills need to be taught. And so we now are working with a wide range of universities to help us teach these skills. We teach them in multiple languages because the basic understanding, the concepts, the 10 rules, which are embedded in literature, embedded in research, those 10 rules are pretty universal. And so I wanted to give you an example of how we're using this. So this is Ubaldo Cordova, who is a chemical engineer in Puerto Rico. And after Maria hit, he called us up and we said, how can we help you? And he said, come down and help us rebuild by teaching people strategic doing. So 2 people in a conversation, we got 6 people to go down to Puerto Rico. We trained about 40 people in 2.5 days. A subgroup of that, 10 people went out and started working in workshops right away and started engaging people in the workshops and started coming up with initiatives very quickly. So the point of this is that if you understand the skills, you can scale this very rapidly. If you also understand the skills, you can build sophisticated strategy processes. Here's one that we've used for a group that was trying to build out a growing network. It's very much like the idea of Legos. And you can also build out a sophisticated managed network of teams. We use the concept of managed networks here to enable us to build out accountability and transparency across teams so that you can develop many partners. We've had initiatives of up to 100 partners. And you can build a process of reporting that enables people to report at different scales. So a core team might report or work together, meet together every 3 months, 4 months. Focus area teams or people that are focused on the particular areas of strategy might meet every 2 months, and then regular teams that are working might meet every 30 days. So you design your own strategy process using the principles. Now I wanted to get into some key concepts. So how are we using this to actually change and design new systems? So let's, I'll just give you some, take you out to the frontier of what we're working on right now and kind of the subject matter of our second book. But it's this notion, we've already introduced this concept of SCurves. And within an organization, SCurves provides a valuable way to think about agility. And if you start to think about a business addressing S-curves, they have to move, businesses have to continuously move to new S-curves, extend the existing S-curves if they can, but move ultimately to new S-curves. And there's really 5 areas of agility that are critically important and 5 areas in which strategic doing would play a role. And those would be recombinant innovation at the early stage, going through a business model, continuous improvement, product market innovation, and then ultimately in the hardest one, release and redeployment of your assets. Let me go into a second key concept, which is innovating networks. We're all familiar with networks, and what we have learned in strategic doing is that not all networks are the same, and that what we really need are innovating networks. That's where collaborations form, where people come together as equals and are creating new value. But that takes time to develop. We have advocacy networks. We're all part of advocacy networks. If we favor a sporting team or an alumni network, we're probably part of a community of practice, which Bowen, you're developing here with innovation systems. But really what you're trying to do, if you're trying to get systems work done, is you need innovating networks, and that requires a high level of trust among the members. And what we've learned is that that takes time to form, and that naturally what we see is that these teams move through different horizons. They move through different, the character of their conversation changes as they go forward. Key concept number 3, some of you have heard about platforms. We think this is a really important concept, especially in the migration from hierarchical structures to more network-based structures, whether they're managed networks or whatever. But here's an example that we use to enable people to understand that we're not trying to restructure the hierarchy. What we're trying to do is identify willing partners to come and join us on a platform to build new opportunities. So we can actually slide these platforms underneath the existing structures, whether that's inside a university or in a company, and it reduces the risk of setting off an immune response among the hierarchy managers. You can design these platforms. Here's an example of a platform that we've designed for interdisciplinary research at a university. There's a set of core functions. There's some focus areas. The red dots are, the yellow squares are projects, interdisciplinary projects. The red dots are researchers. And of course, what you're doing is you're attracting resources to support and sustain that platform. Now, open innovation, we're familiar with that concept. It started out really as open innovation 1.0 from the perspective of the firm. This is what Chesbrough came up with in, 2004 or 5 timeframe. More recently, we've talked about open innovation 2.0, which is much more of an organic concept. And when you start to think about open innovation from that perspective, it becomes very complex because you're dealing with dozens of relationships. And what needs to happen is that you have to have an operating system or a way in which these different agents can communicate with each other and move toward a shared outcome. So an example of that would be developing a project plan, or really a technology roadmap for deployment of condition-based maintenance across the Aegeus destroyer fleet. This was the project that we were asked to work on, and we convened about 60 companies to start. About 20 of those companies continued on with 4 workshops over 6 months, and we developed a project-based plan relatively quickly in that 6-month period. But more important, we were able to show the smaller companies that they could participate in this process without worrying that the larger companies would take advantage of them. So let's move on to the last concept, which is ecosystem platforms. This is another concept that we're working on. And this is the notion that we can form ecosystems, entrepreneurial ecosystems, innovation ecosystems, if we build collaborations in 4 critical areas. In a global economy, we need to start with brain power, both talent and technology, and the capacity to use technology, because if we don't have 21st century brain power, we're not going to be competitive. We need support networks to convert that brain power into wealth and prosperity. This is both supporting startup companies and innovation-led companies. We need quality connected places, physical locations, because both the people and the organizations are mobile and they won't stay in a place that isn't a quality connected place. And then most importantly, perhaps we need new narratives. We need narratives about where we're going. What's the hypothesis about the future that we're trying to build? So as we build these out, we build out new kinds of networks here. And what's interesting about this model that we've used is that these networks are hidden. So what we actually talk about, or what a lot of the academics talk about, is business development, cluster development, creative placemaking, talent development. These are all emergent properties of the underlying collaborations. So here's an example. I'll end with a couple of examples. Here's in 2001, Ernest Andrade wanted to figure out how he could build a dynamic technology environment in Charleston, South Carolina. By using the model I just described, he's been able to do that. And so now the Charleston Digital Corridor is one of the top fastest growing software and internet companies. And then in the last example, I'll start out with my first experience, where I started working on this process in 1993 with Oklahoma City. The top picture is Oklahoma City in 1993. Today, Oklahoma City, same street, is quite more dynamic economy, and in fact, it's often thought of as a national leader now in how do you build these collaborations, these ecosystems built off of collaborations. So if you want to learn more, there's the book, of course, that we've written. Now that we have an infrastructure to train people, we wrote a book, and there's a strategicdoing.net's website, which is the Institute. There's a nonprofit institute that, as I said, holds the core IP to strategic doing. And I just want to thank you now for the opportunity to share some thinking with you. So Bowen, let me go back to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Ed. That was I found it really interesting how you, of course, first described this kind of, coming from a management background, slightly kind of different approach to kind of more traditional forms of strategy, in that it kind of revolves around conversation. And I got the impression that it's a fairly kind of open form of conversation, but with these two guiding questions of where do we go and how do we get there. And then of course he talks about the different kind of concepts, which very interesting, like the platform kind of organization, almost as an alternative to the hierarchy, and open innovation is kind of this network of different stakeholders. And with the ecosystem development. I guess just to, because obviously strategy is a big part of kind of what you discuss, and you've worked with lots of stakeholders in this. How would you say that this, your approach to strategy with strategic doing is different from kind of the traditional, more strategic planning approach? How would you kind of describe the key differences there?
Well, the strategic planning approach started out, again, its roots go back to World War II, and it really became an academic discipline in the 1960s at the Harvard Business School. It's very much of a linear process, and it's a logical, rational approach. Generally speaking, you spend a lot of time gathering data, you analyze this data, you make a decision around the plan, and then you execute the plan. So it's a very, there are variations around strategic planning, but it was really designed, and the premise of strategic planning was designed for hierarchical companies. So a small group of people did all the thinking and everybody else did the doing. When I was a corporate strategy consultant for an offshoot of BCG, we worked with just top management teams at General Electric and Ford and Volvo, which are the three companies I worked with. And we didn't, that's where the thinking was done. And then, the execution was supposed to happen once the plan was in place, everybody was going to execute. Increasingly, as we move toward a network-based environment, one is that hierarchies don't learn very well. They don't learn and adapt very well. Strategic planning is an expensive process. It's costly. And in many situations now, it's really become kind of a sterile budgeting operation that's driven by a calendar as opposed to driven by external stimuli or external events or new opportunities. And so what strategic doing is much more of an adaptive think-do cycle that enables us to think and do on quick time buckets. So again, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. So you're actually guiding the conversation, you're actually aligning your assets very quickly toward the outcomes that you want. And That can work as long as, one, it doesn't require a lot of resources. In other words, you don't need to go out and hire a huge consulting firm to do it. And two, you can teach the skills of having strategic conversations widely across your organization. If those two conditions hold, then you can make the organization much more of a sensing strategic organization. And up until recently, we haven't been able to teach those skills, but now we can. So we can scale the skills. And so the organization, the strategic thinking conversations can diffuse throughout the organization. So it's a different way of thinking about strategy, making resource decisions in a complex environment.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I sense that quite a lot of our community members are kind of wanting to enact systems change, potentially in kind of large organizations or areas where it could be, you talk about the hierarchies, it could be kind of difficult to kind of launch initiatives that maybe challenge the status quo. And I'm curious, kind of, there seems to be some trends. For example, you have a kind of agile methodology, you have design thinking, which kind of looks at more this iterative kind of strategic approach. I mean, from your opinion, how kind of much does this permeate kind of our current time? Would you say that, for example, there are certain organizations where, or contexts where the traditional way of strategic planning works and that's completely fine? Or, in what context would you say that this iterative approach is more suitable?
Yeah, I think you'll find this iterative approach, or people moving toward this iterative approach, when the old approaches don't work very well. So many situations where the strategic plan, you've invested in a lot. So for example, we have had at our lab a Fortune 100 company IT department come to us and said, we've got this strategy that we worked with a big consulting firm on, and then we'd say, well, why are you calling us? And they said, well, we just don't know what to do. Well, of course, by our definition, then you don't really have a strategy, because if you don't know how you're going to get there, if you don't know what you're going to do, then you don't really have a strategy. You have some strategic thinking, perhaps some frameworks, and consultants are very good at that. But the actual execution of doing things isn't going to work. And so part of this is moving toward and experimenting with new approaches to strategy. And the emphasis needs to be on the notion that strategy now has to be as agile and as fast moving as the environment in which we're operating in. And so if it's not, then we'll continuously fall behind. And you start to see that with companies that recognize this. So who's taking up this new approach? We find people calling us are younger managers, people in their 35, 45, early 50s. They're not the C-level folks, but they're people who are confronted with complex challenges that their current toolbox, their current way of thinking about it doesn't work. They've been put on teams. They've been, as one colleague said, I was voluntold to be on this team. And so the team, they're supposed to be doing stuff, and they just can't operate because they don't have a common operating system. They don't know how to meet. They don't know how to gather their assets together. They don't know really what they're trying to do. And so that's the gap that strategic doing fills.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so it's kind of like one route towards this is if kind of the conventional approaches don't work, it's maybe there's more to it. Maybe it's very complex and it's worth experimenting with different approaches.
And we've had situations where, again, like this company, where people have done strategic plans, but they need now to execute. So it's not an either-or world. We've worked with existing strategic plans that often have embedded in them very good thinking, very good framing of challenges, a lot of data that's very helpful, but now they need to execute. And so in the focus areas of the plan, we can start to take each focus area and think about, okay, how do we deploy strategic doing to actually start to mobilize the assets to get done what we need to get done?
Yeah. So one thing I find really fascinating is kind of you describe, or one way of describing strategic doing is an open source operating system to build new ecosystems. And I'm curious, what do you see as typically, or can often be lacking in how communities, currently emerge or organize, which led you to create this type of operating system that you speak of?
Mhm. Well, part of the challenge, of course, is that I did most of the early work in very complex environments like the Oklahoma City economy. How do you take an economy that's been flat on its back for 10 years, the oil price collapse, a banking collapse, not been able to recover, and how do we start to build a foundation for what's next? How do we start to build a dynamic economy? And part of the challenge, and the biggest challenge, is that moving people away from hierarchical thinking and moving much more toward network thinking. And I often think of it as, moving people away from vertical thinking to more horizontal thinking, to start engaging people as equals across organizational and political boundaries, and understanding where are the commonalities, where is the shared value potential, where could we do something together that would enable us to create value that doesn't exist now. And so this is understanding how to have those conversations, and then to leave behind the old conversations that don't work. That's really been the challenge. People tend to fall into old habits, and much of this is a shared collective habit of how to have deep conversations that enable us to test out ideas, to define ideas, design new ideas, but also then to test these new ideas quickly.
Yeah, one thing, because of course conversations, when you kind of look at what we do within organizations, these conversations are so much at the core, and so many, of, for example, projects or ideas that get implemented, it always starts off as a very kind of delicate thing, and it's kind of how you frame and how you kind of bring people together. I'm curious, because so much of your work does relate around having these generative conversations. Do you see any kind of typical kind of things that we do that maybe not be that useful, or things that we could just be more aware of to kind of have more successful dialogue?
Yeah, so the starting point on all of this, Bowen, is what Amy Edmondson has talked about, which is psychological safety, this notion of creating a safe space in which people are basically treated as equals. There's equity of voice. In other words, people are talking about the same amount of time. They're coming together. They're learning. If you don't have psychological safety, which in the political environment is civility, but in a corporate environment we would call psychological safety. If you don't have psychological safety, you can't do complex thinking together. And so that's the first step. And so our first rule of a strategic doing workshop is that we're going to behave in ways that build trust and mutual respect. And we will enforce this rule. We will enforce it. So I'll give you a warning, but I'll walk you out of the room if you're going to. Why is that? Because the people in the room want to do complex thinking. And if you're disrupting that flow, then you're not adding any value at all. And you need to exit the room. And when you come back into the room, you need to adhere to the rules. And again, it's a common sense rule. But we don't enforce it. There's a lot of game playing that happens in universities, people telling one thing and not doing, telling people one thing and doing another. This happens in corporate environments all the time. And these behaviors are fundamentally dysfunctional when you're trying to build complex strategies. You can't do it that way. And so until you have psychological safety established as a cultural norm within the organization, you're not going to, and that's one of the reasons why we create these platforms. Because what we're not trying to do is go into an organization and try to change the culture of the organization. What we're trying to do, that's trying to fix an old problem. What we're trying to do is build a new culture. And if we create a platform and create the rules on which that platform operates, now we're modeling the behavior we want to see.
Yeah, and you mentioned rules, because one thing that I find quite interesting about what you do is that a lot of the projects, for example, that can, or the change that happens in the system that can seem, later on as very complex, can, and this is something that you kind of reiterate, can come from some, establishing the trust, establishing that initial community, and then building some simple rules kind of for operation. Are you able to kind of expand a bit more on, how we go about finding these kind of principles almost by which we move forward, and how you've seen that unfold?
Sure. What we learned over the years that I've been doing this is that complex collaborations emerge out of conversations with an underlying structure and trajectory. They change over time. And the simplest way to think about it is that they have both a design component and a technical component. The design component is really expansive. It's divergent thinking. It's more improvisational thinking. But then within the same workshop, you have to move toward technical problem solving mindset. You have to move toward developing an experiment, a project. My colleagues at the business school I went to call them learning launches, something that teaches you, okay, are your hypotheses likely to be right or not? Because you've made a bunch of assumptions about what's going to work. So now you have to go out and figure that out. And so the challenge is to design and guide these conversations in such a way. And what we've learned is that there are some basic rules. Now, what's fascinating is as we move this into the academic environment, all of the 10 rules that we outline have research support from them, on them, each one of the individual rules, but they come from different disciplines. So there's behavioral economics, there's social psychology, there's cognitive psychology, there's obviously strategic management. There are a variety of different disciplines that all contribute to strategic doing, which underscores why this came out of reflective practice as opposed to an academic setting. It's really a product of what Donald Schoen, who was a reflective practitioner at MIT, called, getting down into the messy swamp, where you have to try to figure it out. And you have to get into the swamp. And then the question that was constantly nagging at me was, if I could learn how to, there was a model I was using in my head continuously to develop these collaborations. But if I could learn how to teach this model, then you could scale it. If it's just me, then it's not a scalable model. But if I can learn how to teach it, then you can scale it. And so it turns out that that's not an easy thing to do. I came to Purdue in 2005. By 2013-14, we had figured out how to scale it. And now at the University of North Alabama, which has got a great online education backbone, we're going to be moving into online education much more aggressively. So yeah. You learn the skills, you figure the skills out, you figure out what the rules are. It's all based on a pragmatist view of the world. If it's helping you solve the problem, then it's probably true. If it doesn't help you, then it's not useful. It's not useful. So this is a different way of generating knowledge than the academy is used to. So that has its own set of challenges.
Yeah. Thinking back to kind of one of your slides earlier, you talk about kind of this ecosystem development, and it relates to a few different threads, but it seems about bringing different perspectives together and creating that kind of medium for collaboration. Something that I've experienced is that often this can lead to much better or more sustainable solutions. However, I find that when you're including lots of perspectives, it can sometimes bring kind of more kind of different goals, different perspectives, and sometimes can add kind of more complexity kind of to the project. In those kind of environments, how do you go about balancing, how do you kind of go about bringing consensus and moving forwards effectively, given the diversity of perspectives? How would you describe that?
So strategic doing, we design strategic doing so that it builds trust at every step of the way. Because again, the test case that we worked on was, okay, people are coming together to work on a complex problem. They don't know each other. They don't work in the same organization. Some of them may be, 60 years old and not very adept at technology. Others are 22 years old and and very technically savvy. So you have all these different viewpoints. You have racial differences, ethnic differences, and the like, gender differences. And so the way in which you have to bring those different perspectives together is, first you have to create a framing question. What is the question that we need to come together? So think about the framing question as a frame that you put out and that you would invite people to participate in. So we think of it as the invitation to conversation. So one of the leadership jobs now is to learn how to develop good framing questions. This is not a trivial problem. This actually is hard to do. We do it in teams all the time. But once you have developed a framing question, by definition, the people that come to that conversation are people who are interested in helping you design a future that would help you solve that framing question or come up with a solution to that framing question. So there is an underlying sense of shared interest already. Now the question is, how do we guide the conversation so that we start to build on the assets that we have in the room? Now these assets are hidden. These assets, we can't see them. I don't know who you know, Bowen. I don't know what your assets are, what your experience is. But it's out of those assets that we are going to build our solutions. And so we need to start to share those assets and listen to each other's assets and start to reveal the ones that we are willing to share. Out of those assets, we can now start building some potential solutions. As we walk through this process, what you see is people listening to each other, people respecting different points of view. When we make decisions about what should we do, because we can only start with one, we do that in a transparent way. We actually use finger voting, because finger voting, we found, is a very effective way to identify differences in points of view. If one person is voting 1 and one person is voting 5, they're looking at the same thing, but seeing different things. So let's pause and find out why. So there are tips and tricks all along the way to build trust and to understand that we are building a solution that no one of us can adopt or can develop on their own, and that every person's perspective has value because it enables us to see this complex challenge in a new way, in a different way. And if you do that deliberately, then you start to build trust across the network. So it's a discipline. As I said before, it's a discipline. And what happens oftentimes is we gather people together, we think about bringing all the stakeholders to the table, and then we don't really have a very good frame. So we don't use the term facilitation in strategic doing. We use the term guides. At the table where this conversation is happening, we have a table guide. And the metaphor is of a river guide or a mountain guide, bringing a group of people up to the top of the mountain, taking some pictures, and again, coming back down again before nightfall. So the guide is going to, most of the time, lead from behind. But occasionally, if people start wandering off the trail, the guide is going to get up in front and slap some folks across the head and say, hey, we got to get going. And so this is what a guide does in strategic doing, is it takes a much more assertive role than a facilitator, which is too passive a role to take. So we do a lot of different steps to build bridges across these divides.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm aware I want to kind of allow a bit of time as well for audience questions. But one last question from me. So I can really sense the benefits of having this kind of more inclusive conversational approach strategy, where you're really bringing in the diversity of perspectives and together co-creating that direction. But when we look around, we still see so many organizations kind of still using this kind of very top-down command and control type of approach. You know, from your kind of experience of working with so many organizations, what would you say are the main reasons we are kind of, so many organizations still use this? And what would you say are the same main barriers for us to kind of use more appropriate kind of approaches based on our context?
Well, part of what you recognize or what you realize when you start something new is that, especially with hierarchical organizations, the chances or the probability that you'll trip off an immune system and immune response is pretty high. And where does the immune response come from? It comes from people who are already benefiting from the current system. Just because you might think that the hierarchy is dysfunctional as you're sitting, at the lower level as a young person at a lower level of an organization, you start to see that actually the hierarchy is working quite well for the people at the top. And so it's not surprising that you'll get an immune response in some respects. And that's one of the reasons we talked about, as I said earlier, why we focus on platforms and the idea of, okay, we have to migrate these organizations toward a more adaptive form. There isn't, we don't have a standard form that we're going to work on. It's going to have some hierarchical elements, in my view. It's going to have some network-based elements, and the balance is going to depend on the organization and its environment in which it operates. But there are hierarchical things that are going to happen. You're not going to eliminate hierarchy. You want people, filling out your tax returns and doing HR reports to follow a procedure.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's predictable. But increasingly, you want your product development folks, you want your people who are working in your supply networks to start thinking about how do we create joint value together. And so you're going to start to migrate toward more network-based forms. And the speed with which that happens is going to be determined by, one, the top management support for experimentation. And if the top management doesn't experiment, then you see what happens with Kodak and Blockbuster and some other companies that don't adapt. That's possible. So if you're at the C level, what you want to do is encourage experimentation. You want to encourage innovation labs. You want to encourage this notion of how could we do this faster, better, cheaper, more productively. And I would just throw out, how much time do you spend in wasted meetings? So I think if you had a more disciplined process to collaboration, you'd actually find more productive meetings. We find that to be the case. So each organization is going to have their own migration path, unless they don't, in which case they're likely to die. So it's kind of a brutal. But one of the things you learn is that markets don't lie. And so, that's just the reality of what we have to deal with today.
Yeah, it's kind of like, adapt or be forced to, yeah.
Well, if you don't create a continuous learning within your organization, I don't see how you survive. I don't see it. And some organizations will be able to manage this quite well, others won't. And a lot of it does depend on, what kind of top cover you have, what kind of support you have from the C-suite and the like. A C-suite doesn't have to see this as a particular threat, but in some cases, in some universities, they do. So, nothing you can do.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just to move to a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure.
So the first one is, how do you ensure that you have the diversity of thinking in the room when you are going through the process?
Perfect. Well, we actually collaborate with a firm out of the Netherlands that helps us come up with a notion of cognitive diversity. And so the way in which we think of cognitive diversity is, again, on the S-curve. And you have people at the low end of the S-curve who are very creative and thoughtful and can connect, very comfortable with horizontal thinking, very comfortable with ambiguity. As you move up the S-curve, you have people who are much more focused on, how do I scale this? How do I create a system out of this? And of course, the people at the top who are really in the process of conserving what assets we have and making sure that we don't waste what we're doing. And the truth is, you need, for any team, you need people all along the S-curve. So we think of cognitive diversity as a much more useful way of thinking about it. And the AM cubed, which is what the technique we use with the Human Insight, which is the company, provides us a window into assembling cognitively diverse teams. It's a very good asset that we rely on. And it's very simple. It's a simple way to do it. So that's how we do it.
Yeah, thank you. And so for the next question, and this was something that interested me as well from your presentation, you talked about this idea of the sliding platform. it kind of that works under the hierarchy and is kind of another way of enacting change, which maybe doesn't face so much of kind of the immune system as you talk about. How do you see this sliding platform working in terms of bypassing power dynamics and inertia? How does that process kind of unfold?
Well, it's hard. In some cases, it's very hard. So if you have a very top-down, old line manufacturing company that's very rigid, creating that kind of platform is hard. We work with young engineers in a chemical company, for example, and what we've suggested is, okay, your platform is actually a group of young managers who are coming together and picking out what is doable with this new approach. What could we do experimenting with this new approach? We have another young engineer who's working on sustainability questions within her company. And what she's learning is that the current capital budgeting process doesn't really allow for sustainability projects to be prioritized. And so the question was, okay, we'll start to build a core team within your company and start to think about how could we create a sandbox or a lab or an experiment to enable us to start working through an alternative capital budgeting model that would prioritize long-term sustainability projects. In a university setting, we simply have created this platform is simply a gathering spot, and so and it brings together people with multidisciplinary perspectives on, say, we've done things like post-harvest, reducing post-harvest feed grain waste in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a big problem. Or increasingly, we're seeing areas of community health and in opioid problems and things like these are all complex problems that require multidisciplinary solutions. So when I say a platform, conceptually it's a platform, but basically it's a group of people coming together, forming a core team to figure out where they can experiment. If they get some high-level support, that obviously can speed the process. But I've seen environments where you don't have the high-level support and you just keep doing it. Improving your own leadership skills. And that's really why we wrote the book. We wrote the book to say, here are the skills, so you can start to actually practice the skills. Pay attention to your conversations. Realize that you can design your conversations. Realize you can guide your conversations by asking questions. Realize all of this is in your hands. These are skills that you probably weren't taught in business school or law school, but they're skills that are increasingly important because we need to address how do you design and guide collaborations. And you do that through conversations that you design and guide.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, it's kind of like, without the people who are willing to take the responsibility and kind of work on the skills, obviously that's preferable to kind of be able to kind of enact the change. It's probably, not really going to happen. So yeah, and I guess maybe the last question, or maybe we have time for one more after this. But so the question is, what does a functional innovation ecosystem look like for you? And what are some good kind of qualities or outcomes that you've seen come from these setups?
Well, I'll put if you go to the website, strategicdoing.net, I'll put on the blog a couple of resources for you to look at. But a good ecosystem, either entrepreneurial startup ecosystem or an innovation ecosystem, is going to have collaborations in these 4 categories, because that's what you need. Any region, any company, frankly, needs to be globally competitive. You need collaborations to build brain power, skills and learning, continuous individuals. You need networks to convert brain power into wealth. How are you going to do that? You need quality connected places where these people can meet and gather and will come. And you need a new narrative, which provides the sense of guidance, the sense of coherence, the sense of here where we are, this is where we're going. And you need a new narrative to guide people. Now, the simple rules of strategic doing enable you to form these collaborations. And the simple rules are no different than the simple rules in a sense of simple rules that guide a swarm. Birds follow simple rules to create these incredible complex processes. In strategic doing, you follow these simple rules and you frame complex collaborations. So we can't design the ecosystem. most important point. You can't design the ecosystem, but you can design the platform on which the ecosystem grows. And that's where you focus.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And just to where we have about just a few minutes left, is there anything that you would kind of like to share to the community? Any kind of final thoughts or updates on kind of on what you're working on or anything like that?
Yeah, well, it's exciting. You know, we're open. Again, we're an open book. Please connect with us if you'd like to learn more. We're working on complex challenges like climate change. Climate change is a new paper came out from the National Academies on this, which is, you know, it's not really a technical problem. It's a socio trigger point problem of how do we build networks to enable us to scale technologies. We're working with the Kauffman Foundation on scaling entrepreneurial ecosystems across the US. Again, I think we can do this now. And so we're eager to work with other colleges, other universities to spread these skills, to teach them. We'll share what we know. And again, the challenge is we've got to, there's a good wonderful author in Canada, Thomas Homer Dixon. And he wrote a book that was very influential in my thinking, probably 2001, 2002 timeframe, called The Ingenuity Gap. And the notion was that the complexity of the things coming at us, we were having difficulty, and we are having difficulty adapting to this complexity. And he was talking about the ingenuity gap, the fact that we're not unleashing human ingenuity. I think the only way to unleash human ingenuity is through collaboration, but collaboration is complex. And the good news is that a group of us have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what collaboration is and how to manage it. And I think we've got some useful starts on that, but we encourage people to participate across our university network or join our university network and help build research around this, because we certainly don't have all the answers at all.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, yeah, it's just interesting, kind of you know, just to I guess take a few themes that stood out for me from this discussion. That, you know, because so many of the context of the organizations that we're in is changing so much because of this complexity and this interconnectedness that you're talking about, that it requires our organizations to be kind of more adaptive from the inside. And, you know, that's on a theoretical level, but actually how it happens in practice is through the conversations and through the collaborations and the right medium of doing that, as you say.
Well, when you think about it, Bowen, conversations are the medium through which we transmit knowledge largely. And, you know, how do we share what we know and share the assets that are hidden in our own networks? This isn't easy. It's not like rocket science. It's more like molecular biology. It's much more complex. And the good news is that there are people working on this, and we're seeing some good results. So we need to figure out how we can learn faster, learn more, spread, and sustain this work. And so that's really what we're working on right now.
Yeah, brilliant. And thank you so much for spending the time to share this with us and all the interesting work that you're working on. Just a quick one as well to our audience. You know, we have a survey which I've shared in the description. So if you have any feedback on this talk, or if you have any suggestions on kind of topics that you'd like to talk about in the future, then do get back to us. Was there anything else that you kind of wanted to add, Ed?
No, Bowen, I think what you're doing and these, you know, if people aren't following your Twitter feed, they should. It's brilliant. It's the best Twitter feed on the planet if you're interested in system change, in my view. So I think what you are doing in terms of taking the complexity or the difficulty of a lot of the systems work and making it comprehensible and usable is really, really important. So I applaud this work that you do. Thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely a claim to fame. So yeah, thank you very much, Ed. Thanks a lot for your time. And thanks for everyone for joining. Thank you, Ed.
Right. Bye-bye.